So I would like to thank the organizers, Lisa and Alla, for this invitation. I know that Gazeta workshop is focused on the history of the press in Russia, Eastern Europe, and Eurasia, but my today's presentation is not quite about that. Instead, I will talk about the application of digital humanities methods to my study of the Gorky Literary Institute. But I must say that the methods that I will present today are broadly applicable to press scholars as well. Maybe at the end of my presentation, the participants could share their experience and thoughts about the usage of DH methods for the study of the press culture. I also would like to use my presentation as an opportunity to promote the upcoming ADSL panel that I helped to organize. The panel is titled Network Analysis of Soviet and Post-Soviet Literature. It takes place on Sunday, February 19th. And the goal of this panel is to demonstrate how network analysis can be used to examine sociological aspects of literature. The papers will analyze the roles of social connections and networks that play in the construction, promotion, and denunciation of literary values in Soviet and post-Soviet literature. I believe that many of you might be especially interested in Georgy Karatkov's paper, From Journal to Network, 1930s Internationalная Literatura Network, in which Georgy will try to show how one can benefit from analyzing literary periodical sources, not as a text, but as a data set, switching the focus from close reading to network analysis. And Philip Glassner's paper might also be of great interest to you, because in his paper, Philip will present the digital project Queer is That, which documents Russian queer publishing of the 1990s. All right, here I will stop my advertising campaign and proceed to the topic of my actual presentation. So my talk today is directly related to my dissertation titled The Gorky Literary Institute, Creative Writing Under Socialism. So first of all, I would like to give a brief overview of what the Gorky Literary Institute was and explain why it is important to study this educational institution. In Russian scholarship, the initial conception of a professional university for writers is often attributed to Maxim Gorky. Even though Gorky indeed was in favor of education for writers, he was a great advocate of this idea, and even organized a journal, Литературная учеба, literary training would probably be the best translation into English. Gorky himself was not directly involved in the organization of the New Writers Institute. By the way, if you're interested in learning more about Литературная учеба, I encourage you to read Vladimir Vyugin's articles. They are great and have a lot of interesting facts. So back to the Literary Institute. In fact, the main mover in the creation of this new institution, which was back then called the Evening Workers Literary University, Вечерний рабочий литературный институт, had been the organizing committee of the Soviet Writers' Union. Yet the active participants in the process always named Gorky in public speeches and press as the initiator of the idea, paving the way for the emergence of the legend that Gorky was the new university's first leader. To seal the connection of the man with the institution, the university was renamed the Gorky Literary Institute in 1946, the 10th anniversary year of Gorky's death. Thus, the institute was able to exploit Gorky's fame and claim his symbolic capital without actual intervention of Gorky in structuring the literary field. But regardless of the actual absence of Gorky at the Institute, it turned out to be enormously successful. It educated writers from across the socialist world for 6 decades and exists up to the present day. The Gorky Literary Institute was the premier educational institution for writers in the USSR and the socialist world more broadly. Its alumni include the most prominent Soviet authors, from officially praised Konstantin Simonov, Margarita Aliger, Viktor Bokov, Konstantin Vashenkin, to those with more ambiguous positions, such as dissident writer Anatoly Gladilin, Bella Akhmadulina, Latvian poet Visma Belshevitsa, and even the person who coined the term samizdat, Nikolai Glaskov, was a student of the institute. To be fair, he did not graduate, but he studied there for about 5 or 6 years. And moreover, renowned authors from across the globe also studied there. For example, Ghanaian poet, the first Secretary General of the Pan-African Writers Association, Atokwe Jono-Kai, Sudanese poet Tajer Siraj Hassan, Malay poet and playwright Gausu Diawara, Iraqi poet Hassab al-Sheikh Jafar, a whole cohort of Mongolian writers, maybe one of the most important here is Begzin Yabuhulan, and later in the 1970s and 80s, quite a few writers from North Korea, Vietnam, and Latin America. But astonishingly, with the exception of a few memoirs, no retrospective historical account of this institution has ever been published in Russian, Anglophone, or any other scholarship. So drawing on archival resources from the Russian Federation, Germany, Eastern Europe, and West Africa, my dissertation presents an empirically rich account of the Gorky Institute as a key element of Russian, Soviet, and socialist literary history, as well as of the transnational history of creative writing as a discipline and an educational subfield. Now, why do I believe that cultural institutions are so crucial for the understanding of the Soviet literary field? Literature is more than mere technique, but rather, to use Pierre Macheret's term, quote, the real process without which artifice would remain entirely fictitious. In other words, literature is a product of social interactions between producers, consumers, patronage systems, institutions, and in the capitalist case, markets. In this equation, as I said, institutions, and especially institutions of higher education, play a significant role. Mark McGurl, the author of famous book, The Program Era, who studies the impact of mass higher education and the creative writing program on the development of post-war American fiction, writes, and I will quote him here. The rise of the creative writing program stands as the most important event in post-war American literary history. And paying attention to the increasingly intimate relation between literary production and the practices of higher education is the key to understanding the originality of post-war American literature, end quote. The emphasis on the role of institutions is even more pertinent in the Soviet case. In the absence of the market in socialist systems, the defining importance of institutions was even greater. So the Gorky Literary Institute was one of the most important institutions of the Soviet literary field. My claim of its importance can be substantiated via an examination of the fates of its graduates. Some of them, as we saw, became literary stars of Soviet and in some cases of world literature. Others worked as editors in all union, Republican, and regional publishing houses. Some were satisfied to work as reporters or in even more humble positions of literary consultant and proofreader in various journals and newspapers, while still others worked in theaters, radio studios, film studios, and institutions of secondary and higher education, or were organizers of small literatury кружки, literary clubs, and объединения, associations. So most importantly, the majority of them were employed in literary or literary adjacent spheres. Therefore, the Institute was constructive for the whole field of Soviet literature, not only its center, but also various peripheries. In my dissertation, I use various methodological frameworks to analyze the Literary Institute. I use a modified version of Pierre Bourdieu's conception of sociological fields. I also study generations because of various generations at the Institute. So I use Karl Mannheim's concept of sociological generations, as well as Wilhelm Pinder's theory of aesthetic generations. And because the Institute was a multinational and multilingual project, I also do use the conception of minor literature by Deleuze and Guattari. I use close reading to analyze text written by graduates and instructors of the Institute, but today I would like to focus on another methodology, which is digital humanities methods. I use the term digital humanities in a very broad sense. For me, it unites methods of distant reading, data visualization, network analysis, mapping, and various computational approaches to the study of culture. Initially, my interest in applying digital methods to the study of the Gorky Literary Institute was inspired by a study conducted by Richard Genso and Andrew Piper, in which they compared novels produced by MFA and non-MFA graduates. MFA stands for Master of Fine Arts, the two-year program, master program for writers. So they collected a sample of 200 novels written by graduates of MFA programs from over 20 leading programs in the US. And for the sake of comparison, they also collected a similarly sized group of novels published over the same time period by authors who haven't earned an MFA degree. And using a variety of tools from the field of computational text analysis, they studied how similar authors were across a range of literary aspects, including diction, style, theme, setting, and the usage of characters. As opposed to McGurl's rather celebratory account of the influence of creative writing programs on the quality of the US fiction, Genso and Piper painted a gloomy picture in which, quote, the MFA doesn't merit many of the hyperbolic claims about its impact on literature. As they put it, $200 million per year, after all, is a high price to pay for very little measurable impact. So in other words, they did not find significant distinctions between authors with an MFA degree and without one. So I think their conclusion regarding weak impact can be partly explained by the structure of their study. They chose only those novels by non-MFA writers that were reviewed in the New York Times. Thus, the absence of difference between MFA and non-MFA writers can also be explained just by the demands of the powerful gatekeepers, such as publishing houses. In my case, I initially thought that I can conduct a similar study and compare works of the Gorky Literary Institute graduates with those writers who never attended this institution. But I also did not want just to see a similar result, which would just reflect the demands of Soviet publishing industry or Soviet publishing houses overall. So to overcome this bias, which are present in Genso's and Piper's work, I planned to introduce unpublished literary works of the Institute graduates to my data set. But unfortunately, it turned out to be a very, very difficult enterprise. So unpublished works are all stored in the Institute archive at Rogali. And as you may know, all the hard copies are available only there. So you have to go there and type all of that. And it's just impossible with lengthy novels, and pictures are not allowed. I thought of maybe just ordering scans, but after counting how much money I should pay for that, I decided not to do that. So we'll see. But I do still feel like that computational text analysis can be promising, and maybe I'll talk a little bit about that at the end of my presentation. So I turned to other methods, namely network analysis, mapping, and data visualization. So let's start with network analysis. In literature, network analysis is generally used to interpret literary texts and describe relations between characters in a novel or a play. Each character is a node, and these nodes are connected by edges, which usually signify communicative relations. For example, here is a network graph of Brusov's play Zemlya that I made a couple years ago. So each node is a character in Zemlya, and each edge represents a occurrence. That is, whenever two characters are on stage, they should be linked by an edge. The more often these characters exist in the same physical space, the thicker the edge. And the network construction is only the first step, which should be followed by actual analysis, the calculation and interpretation of various parameters, including network density, clustering coefficient, maximum degree, and so on and so forth. So my approach to the study of the Literary Institute is very similar, with the only exception, I do not analyze text here, but actual people. That is not very usual in literary studies. However, several cases exist. The one which is closer to mine is a German research platform. It's still under construction, but the website is working. It's called Literarisches Feld DDR, GDR Literary Field, which is currently focused on students of the German Literary Institute, Literaturinstitut Johannes Erbecher in Leipzig. Here on the slide, you can see a network of co-publications of students of this institution. So for my network of people who were in some way related to the Gorky Literary Institute, I have to collect a tremendous amount of data. These guys, they have maybe about 350 people in their database currently. I have to collect much more. So the central goal of my data collection process is to collect bio-bibliographic information about students, instructors, administrators, translators, editors, and other people involved with the Institute. The majority of the data I collect comes from 4 sources. First of all, it's a reference book from 2006, Они учились в Литинституте. It's basically a long list of people who ever attended the school, but unfortunately it is very incomplete and has numerous mistakes. And the biggest problem for me is that for the most part, they do not have information on which creative writing seminars students attended. So to gather that information, I actually do have to work in the archive of a literary institute, which is housed in Regali. So currently I cannot do that. So what I actually do, I read memoirs of students. There are 4 volumes of memoirs. And whenever someone mentions that they were in the same class, I use it as a source for my data, but obviously it's a very long process. And it's a little bit risky to rely on somebody's memory. So I do hope that at some point I'll be able to go back to Moscow and work a little bit in the archive just to prove that all my data is correct. And I obviously do use open sources. Sometimes simple Googling is helpful. My database has linked data structure, which means that each entity is linked with another entity. So my main entity people, and you can see all the field names, is linked to subsidiary entities, students, teachers, cities, organizations. In the future, I don't have that yet, but I'm planning to extend my database by adding translators, administrators, publications, reviews, editors, and awards. So as I said, the data collection process is very notorious and time consuming. And so far I was able to collect much less information than I planned. So more than 5,000 students studied at the Gorky Literary Institute between 1933 and 2006, as opposed to just 350 in Leipzig's institute. And more than 1,000 students also attended the higher literary courses, Высшие литературные курсы, a 2-year program at the Institute for writers from various Soviet republics. So even if I limit myself to the time frame of my current dissertation project, which is roughly from the beginning of 1950s to the end of the 1970s, there is still about 1,450 students. So today I will present a very small subset of this group, just 130 students who graduated from the Institute between 1959 and 1965. When I say database, actually it's just simple Google Sheets. I do know that it's much better to actually have a real database, but to be fair, my data is pretty small currently, and the functionality of Google Sheets work pretty well. And you can see that there are in the bottom, each entity is a separate sheet, and they are connected through the same column, let's say person ID or the name of the city. There are connections between them. Okay, so to build a network, I need to identify nodes, people, and edges, relationships between them. And I use a tool called Gephi to build a network in Gephi, one needs two files. So the first file is notes. It consists of all the information about people. So in my case, I do have ID, label, which is basically the full name. And then I have date of birth, death, place of birth, place of death, gender, languages, and genres. But it honestly would be sufficient just to have ID and a label. That's the most important. And the second table is edges. So here you have a source and a target. Both of them are people. Let's say a source is a teacher. Alexander Kovalenkov was a teacher of Vladimir Firsev. So he's a source of literary knowledge for a target, for his student, for Alexander Kovalenkov. Weight, this parameter signifies how much your source and target nodes were related. The more the weight, the thicker the relation between them. And I use various ideas how to calculate that. Sometimes, I guess the easiest way is just to see the number of years people were in a relationship, or for translators, I also see the first translation, the second, and the last translation, and just try to see again the number of years. And the type can be either directed or non-directed. So if it's a non-directed, it means that the relationship are not hierarchical, but if you feel that there is a direction from a source to a target, let's say again, a teacher directs his knowledge to a student, then you can also build a directed graph with arrows. All right, so this is my outcome. You will not be able to see anything because there are a lot of people. It looks not very readable, but I can explain what you're looking at. So you look at the graph where each node is either an instructor or a student. And the nodes in the center are instructors. In my case, they are Vladimir Lizin, Alexander Kovalenkov, Nikolai Tomashevsky, Lev Kasil, Mikhail Svetlov, Ilya Silvinsky, Lev Ashanin, Pavel Antokolsky, and Evgeny Dolmatovsky. And it looks like a flower because students of each instructor are clustered together. So probably, as you can tell, in the current form, the network is not very informative, but I expect when I add translators and editors to see which students, like who in the network were more active. In that case, the node's going to grow and the connections between them, the edges will become thicker. So it will tell me who were more active in the literary field and also more central to the network. So currently I'm also collecting texts published by graduates of the Institute in order to conduct textual analysis in the future. As opposed to Richard Genso and Andrew Piper, instead of comparing students of the Gorky Literary Institute with other writers who did not study there, I am planning to compare students of one instructor with students of another instructor. And just by dividing the corpus, by instructors, I hope to see similarities and differences between works of students who were trained by a specific writer. I can already tell that for some writers that doesn't make any sense. Just even without using any computational textual analysis, just by knowing what kind of people studied there, I can simply say that that's not always true. I already mentioned Alexander Kovalenkov and Vladimir Firsev, who was a proponent of, let's say, classical Russian syllabotonic poetry, and was also a very party-minded person. He wrote a lot about the motherland and Lenin and party. At the same time, in the same classroom, there were Bella Akhmadulina, Yuna Moritz, Yuri Pankratov, so people who were more interested in formal and thematic innovation. So I don't know whether this approach will show any interesting outcomes in terms of poetry, but I do believe that something can be said about prose, because in that case, the conversation is less so much about the form and more about the content. So I do hope to do that with prose. And I will talk a little bit about the textual analysis aspect at the end of my presentation. Another possible usage of network analysis is to study the relationships between students and their career after graduation. So here's a new graph, also very tiny, also very small. So here, each node is either a student or an organization in which the person was employed after graduation. And obviously, the most central organization is the Soviet Writers' Union, because the majority of graduates who worked in literature eventually would become the union's members. But you can see some other organizations here, and the color of nodes and edges depends on the value of the parameter called a modularity class. In network analysis, modularity is a quality index for community detection. So for example, orange edges represent people who are a part of the Azerbaijani literary subfield, light green, those who worked in Dagestan, then light blue, who worked in large publishing houses and influential newspapers like Sovetskiy Pisатель, Pravda, and Izvestia. But again, since there is no sufficient data, these clusters currently are relatively small, and overall the graph is not dense, but I believe that after I add more data, I will see more clusters, and I'm more interested not in clusters so much because as you can tell without looking at the graph that yes, people who worked in Azerbaijan were connected, that's obvious without any computational analysis, but I'm more interested in connections between those clusters, whether based on language, nationality, or some other reasons. All right, so having a linked data structure when each entity is connected through a parameter with another entity is also great when you need to visualize your data. You can obviously do that in Excel. Building graphs in Excel is pretty simple, but it's much more convenient in the tool called Tableau, and it's pretty easy to use. So you can see in my slide here again that my entities are connected. People and teachers and students and cities are all connected through either person ID or the name of the city. And then when you have this connected linked database, you can build various visualizations. I didn't have time to build anything complicated for this presentation, but I can show you the possibilities. So this is a super simple graph where you can see the gender of students, either male or female, and you can easily do that in Excel too. But Tableau also can do things that are not possible in Excel, is filter this existing graph. So on the right, you can see the same graph, but filtered by specialization. You can see prose writers, so students who were in prose seminars, or those who were in poetry. There are a few students whom I don't know yet where they were. And maybe there was one person who studied in a poetry seminar and then switched to prose. And this is just an example. It's also possible to add languages, let's say, and compare how many female and male authors were across languages. You can add their regions, cities, genres, and many other filters. Okay, Tableau can even build maps. If you have coordinates of places, it generates map automatically, but it's very simple map. Two problems here. One, it's obviously contemporary borders. It's not the Soviet Union. And second thing, if you have to do something more complicated, if you want to cluster your cities into different colors for whatever reason, if you want to change the size of the marker, if you want to have a timeline so your map is dynamic, then unfortunately Tableau cannot do that, and you have to use something more complicated. In my case, I do use Leaflet, but you have to know coding. it does require JavaScript, and unfortunately it doesn't work automatically. You can see simple things that I did with Leaflet. Give me a second. Okay, I'll show you here. So this is places of birth in Leaflet. And here you can see already that the markers have different size. Moscow and Kiev are bigger than other places. And you can also see that there are a lot of small places, like small places in Kazakhstan. What is that? Semey. And here is Kluchi. And then to compare this map, I also built places of death. And we have a different picture here, much less cities. And the marker for Moscow is even bigger. You can also see quite a big marker for Makhachkala and something in Turkmenistan, Ashgabat, right, Novosibirsk. So, right, I need to go back to my presentation mode. Sorry. To make it clear, this is a visualization from Tableau. From these two maps and these two graphs, we can see that birthplaces were usually distant and small locations, while death places are larger cities like Moscow and other regional centers, Makhachkala, Ufa, Ashgabat, and so on and so forth. So the Gorky Literary Institute was located in Moscow, the cultural and political center of the USSR, and arguably of the socialist world. And we see that only 12% of students in my database were born in Moscow, while 45% of them died in Moscow, which means that aspiring writers who came to Moscow to study became not only a part of the Institute's patronage and networking systems, but also enjoyed all the professional benefits of living in the socialist cultural center and often decided to stay there. But perhaps the most important outcome of training at the Gorky Literary Institute was the international literary network that its students built during 5 years in Moscow. In this regard, the Institute functioned as a hub connecting various people from different parts of the Soviet Union and even different countries writing in different languages and helping them to collaborate. So I'm hoping to prove this point by extending my network and adding more students as well as information about mutual translations, reviews, and co-publications. So before I conclude, I promise to give just a final couple words about computational text analysis. As I said, I'm planning to add texts of students and analyze them as a corpus divided by their instructors. I haven't done it yet. I'm still in the data collection process stage, but I have conducted something similar on a small data set. So if you are not familiar with computational text analysis and you have no background in coding, probably the easiest way to start doing that is just to look at the tool called Royant. It's an open source and free tool. Just open the website and you can upload TXT files there. So here what I did, I upload TXT files of poems from a collection, from a prominent collection from 1962, День поэзии, Day of Poetry. And you can just play around with this tool very easily. You can look at the cloud of words. You can see the frequencies of words. There's a built-in tool, which is called stop words, so that you don't see words like I, a, ya. But you can also extend this list if you want to. You can add your own words if you feel like the word nod or pod doesn't make any sense for analysis. And obviously here you can't learn anything about statistical significance. This is just frequencies. I do find it useful for students, just to introduce them to the world of distant reading, just to show some fun graphs. But if you do want to do some serious textual analysis, probably you do have to learn some coding. So what did I do with this collection? I did use Python and Fisher exact test. So Fisher's exact test is usually used for categorical data that result from classifying objects into two different ways. And it is used to examine the significance of the association between the two kinds of classification. Just to make it as simple, let's say there are women and men, and there are people with high education and people that do not have high education. So if you want to prove that, let's say women are on average more educated, you can use this Fisher's exact test. So in my case, I initially divided the whole collection, Dane Paese, into two groups: students who graduated from the Gorky Literary Institute and writers who have no connection to the institute whatsoever. And then I tried to see whether there are any words that are more frequent and significantly more frequent in one or the other group. So obviously, it reveals no homogeneity in the works of the Gorky Literary Institute's students and graduates. The only observation that I got is that in the text of Literary Institute students, words "yay" and "mayay" occur significantly more often than in the works of those authors who never studied at the Gorky Institute, but semantically that doesn't mean anything. So then I thought that maybe the degree doesn't matter that much, and I can divide authors by their age, at the time of the publication of the collection. And here you can see some groups, and results change. So if we just divide authors by generations, we can see some age-relevant lexicon. P number here is in statistics, it's called p-value. It's a level of marginal significance within a statistical hypothesis test, which represent the probability of the occurrence of a given event. You don't really have to know what it means, but basically if it's smaller than 0.05, then you have a significant result. So this approach seems a little bit more promising to me, and maybe in the future, instead of analyzing all the works of Literary Institute graduates, regardless of when they graduated, I do have to take into account either years of their graduation or their age group, or maybe, as I said before, their instructors, and also genres, and see how that's going to work. And I do believe that dividing people by generations also helped me to examine the mechanism of transmission of cultural and literary values between generations of Soviet writers. So to conclude, I would just say that many people are skeptical about digital humanities methods, and I always sounded skeptical today. But obviously, it's not a remedy. The fact that you have a lot of data doesn't mean that you're going to get great results. But sometimes it's just easier to see things more clearly when you have a big picture. And sometimes you can also find things that you did not expect to find. And if you're ready to spend a lot of time on data collection process, because this is the most important and the most painful process, coding is not that difficult as opposed to just collecting all the data. So if you are ready to do that, and if you find value in doing that, then you should definitely do it. But if you think that you probably can come up with the results you are expecting without this meticulous process, maybe that's not the way to go. But I would like to hear what you think, and maybe if you have any experience with working with press. I know that there are a lot of people who do a lot of work with especially textual analysis and topic modeling, examining the press culture. And if you have any ideas or thoughts about that or about my presentation, I would be happy to hear that.